All right, well, welcome everybody. My name is Emil Doak. I'm the Executive Director of the American Conservative, and I'm pleased to welcome all of you to our special dinner conversation titled A New Fusionism, a Conservatism for Our Current Moment. I wanted to have this conversation in conjunction with the Philadelphia Society meeting this year because I think we conservatives find ourselves in a somewhat similar moment to what we had in 1955 when we forged this fusionism that's really dominated the conservative movement for the last at least half century and more. It's no news to anyone in this room that Frank Meyer's project of synthesizing political tendencies towards virtue and liberty had its fierce critics at the time. Murray Rothbard called Meyer a libertarian manque, I believe is how you pronounce that. Russell Kirk famously called libertarians chirping sectaries. So it's safe to say that this was a bold endeavor to fuse these two tendencies together. And I think today we see a similar fissure between those on the right who value tradition, who are more tradition-minded, and those who are more liberty-minded, our libertarian friends. Issues like woke capitalism, the opioid epidemic, and our many nation-building wars around the globe have pushed the fusionist project to the brink, causing many to question the value of the fusionist project in the first place, and whether a synthesis of tradition and liberty is really viable or possible moving forward for the American right. But I think that it's important to remember that Meyer's project largely succeeded. Whether the form that fusionism actually took was really what Meyer envisioned, the American right largely coalesced around that three-legged stool, roughly resembling the fusionist project. This obviously is the strong national defense, the free markets, and the traditional social values. And this conservatism spawned countless institutions, many of which are represented here in this room today, and many of which we saw at the Philadelphia Society earlier. The Philadelphia Society itself is in many ways one of these institutions. It trained generations of conservative activists. I myself have been through many of these programs. And importantly, it wielded real political power, most notably in the presidency of Ronald Reagan. And for a large part, I think that this stool made sense at the time. Cold War competition with the Soviet Union offered an existential statist threat to the American way of life. We had a direct example of a regime that was secular, in which government was stifling every aspect of life, in which government was overweening and directing so many aspects of everyday life, and which posed an explicit threat to American interests as well. So in response, a political program that emphasized liberty, faith, and national defense, I think made a lot of sense. And I will note, too, that it's to National Review's credit, we have National Review represented here tonight, one of our keynote speakers, that it hosted the discussions back then that forged this influential political program. To me, that speaks to the value of smart, well-edited, middle-brow magazines, of which you all have a copy on your seat. And the right needs them now more than ever, and I'm humbled to be leading one today. But I do think that the times are different now, and the political challenges that we face are also different. The Cold War is over, and the challenges that first forged the fusionist consensus are very different. We need to reignite conversations that conservatives, maybe fusionists, should have had since at least the end of the Cold War, but didn't. Our magazine, The American Conservative, explicitly made this case in 2002 when we launched in opposition to the Iraq War. Indeed, we now endeavor to host these conversations to forge a conservatism that is appropriate for 2022 and beyond. So back then, we were concerned that our national defense posture no longer made sense in a unipolar moment and would lead to disastrous meddling in backwaters across the globe. We were concerned that economic liberalization would swing too far towards over-financialization, leading to reckless spending, lending, and concentration among a few big dominant firms. And we were concerned that in the social realm, we were trending too fast towards an all-encompassing license, and that the civilizational foundations of faith and family were eroding far too fast. And I think if you look at the last 20 years or so, all of these have really panned out. In many ways, our intrepid founders were right on all of the major issues at the time in 2002. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the fusionist project need be condemned to the ash heap of history. Instead, we must assess the prospects for a new fusionism, hence the title of this evening's dinner. One designed to meet this current moment and address the challenges that we face today in 2022. And just like in 1955, this fusionism needs to be debated, discussed, and forged in a well-edited, middlebrow magazine of ideas. We at the American Conservative intend to be the publication that gives us that new fusionism. We celebrate our 20th anniversary this fall, and as we look towards the next 20 years of the American Conservative, we have ambitious plans to scale our influence and become that magazine. Specifically, our new redesigned website will be unveiled in May that will allow us to better feature our content and better engage our audience. We have plans to invest heavily in subscriber acquisition to grow our audience, and we are looking to move to a more frequent publication of our print magazine in 2023. We're strengthening our masthead, attracting the best talent in the right of center space. Our print editor, Helen Andrews, whom you'll hear from tonight, is spearheading that as well. But we are also finding ways to pursue this mission of advancing Main Street conservatism beyond just our magazine and our journalism exploits. Our podcasts, fellows program, conferences, and events reflect our realization that the ideas advanced in the magazine can have an even greater impact if we bring them to life through these different programs. And I would just plug one of them. We have a major conference coming this Thursday on the Russia-Ukraine crisis. We are partnering with American Moment, another excellent new organization whose president is here tonight, Saurabh Sharma, on Up From Chaos, Conserving American Security. I'd encourage all of you, if you're going to be in Washington, please come, but also to check that out. We have an excellent lineup of speakers this Thursday in Washington. So anyways, I want to thank you all for joining us this evening. I want to thank especially our supporters of this dinner, most especially Howard and Roberta Amundsen, Neil Freeman, and Joseph Johnston Jr., as well as Daniel McCarthy, Tom Pauken, Paul Sanderford, and the Padilla Times. I would encourage all of you to continue to engage with our work by becoming a member of the American Conservative at theamericanconservative.com and reading our content, reading our print magazine, and listening to our podcasts as well. But before I go, I do want to thank him to whom we are most grateful. Ask God to bless our food this evening. So if you would join me in a blessing. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, bless us, O Lord, and these thy gifts, which you are about to receive from thy bounty through Christ our Lord. Amen. Thank you all, and enjoy your dinner. All right, well, thank you, everyone. I am pleased to introduce our feature program this evening to discuss that question of a new fusionism, whether that's possible for our current moment. With us tonight, I am very honored and pleased to have two of the leading thinkers on the American right today. First is Helen Andrews. She is the editor of our print magazine at the American Conservative. So if you have any issues with any of the stories in that magazine on your table, take them up with Helen. That is her fault. But she is also the author of Boomers, The Men and Women Who Promised Freedom and Delivered Disaster. It's an excellent book that profiles, 6 boomers, I believe? Yeah. 6 terrible boomers and how awful they are. So I would encourage you all to buy that, not from Amazon. Buy it direct. Don't give Jeff Bezos your money. And Helen's work has appeared widely, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, First Things, Claremont Review of Books, and many, many others. Joining Helen this evening is Michael Brendan Dougherty. He is a senior writer at National Review and also author of My Father Left Me Ireland, An American Son's Search for Home, another excellent book, which I would encourage you all to buy direct from the publisher. And previously, before National Review, he has also served as associate editor at the American Conservative, so he is an alumni of our publication as well. So we have 2 excellent experts on this topic for you this evening, and I will hand things over to our speakers.
Well, thank you, Emil. That's right. Yeah, I forgot that you were a TAC alum, so it's all a family affair.
Full circle.
So I'm hoping tonight to start with the general and move more specific. So let's start almost as general as possible on this question. We're going to be talking about a new fusionism.
Okay.
And so before we get to what's new about it, let me just ask you at the top, are you optimistic or pessimistic about the prospects for fusionism just as a quality of the right?
Neither, actually. I'm going to split that question in half. And maybe I'm giving away a little bit of my conclusion here, but having been in the movement now for almost almost 20 years, it seems, fusionism is almost inevitable. So that can be a good or a bad thing. Like a marriage of convenience could lead to a very happy family in the long run, or it could be a total disaster, depending on what you do with it. And so, yeah, I came into the conservative movement sort of in more of the Russell Kirk mode. We have to kick out the chirping sectaries. Libertarians are devoted to liberty in the Slavish, simple way that the left is dedicated to equality. Ultimately, it leads them to be monsters like Ayn Rand and lead us to Homo economicus. And we have to just get rid of them because they're not suitable for the challenge of our time. But I've found you never can get away from them. That is, as soon as traditionalist conservatives start a new project, even a project like the American Conservative, all of a sudden there are other libertarians out there that are anxious to get involved, to fund it, to contribute. So I've come to appreciate that, and of course, there's never been a time like the last 2 years under COVID to remind me of the value of individual liberty as part of the common good, because there was no more bullying concept than the common good that was used to efface our religious liberty, our individual liberty, the liberty of businesses to run, of families to educate their children. And although I think some of them were a little bit slow off the gun, libertarians joined the right side of that fight. So I wouldn't say I'm optimistic. It's just this is an inevitability of the right. That's my view.
Well, perhaps surprisingly, I'm going to not, take a lash to the chirping sectaries. I'm going to say nice things about the libertarians.
Okay.
Because my own perspective on fusionism is that, certainly historically, each of the factions brought something different to the table, and each of their contributions had value. But since you brought up COVID, one of the great contributions of the libertarians to the conservative movement, and this is not my opinion, this is the opinion of William F. Buckley, was intellectual integrity. They kept us honest. And they also tended to furnish a lot of intellectual heft. They were quite economically sophisticated, philosophically sophisticated. And this was in counterbalance or in stark contrast to their numbers, because certainly the libertarian vote is not out there swinging all that many elections. So since you brought up COVID, I observed as a historical fact that in April 2020, it was never more important, precisely as you say, to stand up for liberty as a fundamental human value to which we are all entitled, and which cannot be encroached upon beyond certain limits, no matter the value to the common good. There are certain things you just can't force people to do. But I noticed that the people saying that were people like Rusty Reno of First Things, people like Peter Hitchens. It was the trads, and it was Reason Magazine and the libertarians who were inclined to shrug and say, well, I suppose it's all right. The comparison I would make is almost to progressives in the era of eugenics, right? And in fact, vaccination was the moral comparison that they made. They say if the state is entitled to stick a vaccine in you, then eugenics seems, within the powers of the state. And it was the Catholic trads saying there are certain liberties you can't mess with. So did COVID show us that whatever value libertarianism might have, the libertarians that we have right now are not pulling their weight in terms of speaking up for liberty? How would you interpret the last couple of years? You say they've come around?
I think maybe not every libertarian or professional libertarian came around soon enough. But I actually think the broad-based revolt against COVID tyranny, against vaccine mandates, was a kind of populist libertarian spirit in the American people. People who, who don't read, the works of Bruce Fronin here or Michael Brennan Dougherty. They don't read. I'm like almost riffing on Pat Buchanan's Conservatives of the Heart. They don't read Edmund Burke, but they knew that this was wrong. Whether this is everyone from pizza shop owners in Staten Island to people who want to run their business in Miami, Florida, were suddenly in revolt against an expert class that told them that all of their interests could be managed by Dr. Fauci and a handful of people meeting with the president. And to me, that was, we saw this revolt spread to kind of populist libertarian figures like, and even media chancellors like Dave Rubin or some of these other populists who kind of make a living off of YouTube or whatever it is. So I just think that's been an inescapable part of the American experience, that we have this ideal of individual liberty planted deep within us. And you don't have to be a conservative, a Buckleyite, to take possession of that and take that into your politics. So I've been grateful for that spirit and grateful for the libertarians that treasure it, even if, a few at the beginning were so afraid of being inexpert or against the best expertise. And I include myself. I'll cop, in the first month, I too thought that a few weeks of restriction could be a few weeks of restriction, and how wrong I was. And I'll never forget that lesson, in fact, that, I thought we could manage what was managed in some polities for some time, which was a short, sharp bit of restriction followed with ferocious restrictions at the border to keep the disease out until you could manage it better, potentially. And we saw that in some places like New Zealand. There were, for a time, a simulation of normality existed with a ferocious guarding of the border. But then that eventually gave way to coercion and tyranny, as it did just about everywhere else, including here at home. So, I will never forget that individual liberty is part of the common good. That is seared into me forever.
So when you give the government power, even if you give it to them for good reasons and for good purposes, very often it turns out badly. That's a nice segue into economics, which seems to be the point of greatest friction.
Sure.
That is, when you ask people who are conservatives how they feel about national conservatism or the realignment, very often the fault line that separates the new generation from the people who say, now wait a minute, go back to fusionism, is economics.
Sure.
So what's your read of that fault line right now?
It's hot, but there are chances for, what is it, the lame phrase that Catholics use sometimes, mutual enrichment. There's a chance for older line conservatives and the new right to teach each other a few lessons, I think. We've seen the new right look to figures like Viktor Orban in Hungary, who I would defend in most circumstances. But when Viktor Orban, in a few months before an election, started imposing price controls on basic commodities, I just know enough of my history in the United States to know that this is a disaster policy that won't work out well in the long run, and is a kind of shameful election year gimmick of a policy. You have to be robbing someone with a price control like that. However, on the other side, I think increasingly the argument I've been making internally, maybe at NR and in other forums, that's been winning hearts and minds, is that what we have called free trade with China is China's mercantile policy being enacted on us. And we have to be very conscious of that we are, the fact that American banks can make money selling American jobs and expertise to the Chinese Communist Party, that's not a free market exchange or a system. And that argument has been winning out. And I think you will see traditional conservatives, as the Chinese Communist Party continues to use the power it can exercise through commercial arms of its institutions to compel behavior among us. You know, they can get a hotel worker fired in Utah for accidentally liking the wrong tweet about Tibet, or make an NBA player say ridiculous things about Muslims in Western China. That brings about resentment and will bring about a reaction. And we're seeing already a knowledge that we can and have to onshore some of our key technologies, that we can't have a situation where 90% of the microchips in the world are made in Taiwan, which is that's putting almost all your eggs in one basket. When literally a microchip is put in every modern car that's made, and now almost every refrigerator, we would face tremendous economic disruption if China ever goes after Taiwan. So I think there's plenty of room for enrichment there.
We should have fewer dishwashers with microchips in them. That's what I think. Cars don't even, anyway, that's another conversation. So I'm very proud of my magazine's record on a lot of these issues. You know, we were right on things like China from the very beginning, warning against it. That being said, I sometimes worry about a realignment going too far in the other direction. What lesson of fusionism do you think the National Conservatives or realignment folks are most in danger of forgetting? Because that's the thing about economic lessons. They're very expensive to learn. You don't want to have to learn by error, trial and error, because it can be costly.
What is the lesson from fusionism that the new right needs to learn?
Not price controls. Thankfully, we don't have anybody pulling an Orban saying that we don't need to teach them that price controls are bad.
Don't need to teach them that price controls are bad. I do think we cannot accomplish. The new right often makes fun of, and I have made fun of, this idea that there's no way with policy to just revive culture. People say, oh, politics is downstream from culture, so on lots of cultural issues, you just have to focus on the culture somehow without talking about the policies that interact with the culture. So we have to make people, I guess, dislike gay marriage or abortion more before we can legislate against it. And the new right has made some excellent points that fortune favors the bold, and that you should, in fact, have the courage of your convictions. You should do justice when you have the chance, and not be timid in the face of cultural attitudes, but show your willingness to lead on them. However, the fact is we are losing these cultural issues, not just because Ted Cruz is too timid or something like that, but because our church leaders are too timid, our institutions are too weak, our families are, as we heard today, in a state of decadence. So we do need a cultural politics that doesn't always cash out in a policy or a check or a subsidy. It can't. I mean, you just, and you don't see anywhere where that has worked a miracle. There's no Western country that has been able to get its birth rate to above replacement level just with a subsidy. I mean, you've seen very modest adjustments, some of them easily reversed or shown to be merely like you're inducing people to have their 1.6 child a little faster than they would have beforehand because you gave them an extra check. But you actually have to, a cultural politics also means giving people a vision of something to believe in, a vision of society that they want to live in. And one thing that I think maybe all fusionists have failed in, old and new, is talking about the future, right? Like we always talk about culture like it's all entropy, that it is just we started with good forms and now those good forms are falling apart and ours is a totally defensive effort. And I think that is, it's not appealing. One, it basically advertises to potential conservatives that we are losers and we are destined to lose in some fundamental way. We need a politics of revival and resurrection and repristination of our ideals. And that means we have to create a vision of the future that is conservative. Right now, the vision of the future that people see, and Peter Thiel, one of those libertarians who shows up strangely whenever traditional conservatives try to get away from fusionism, he's right. He has said that the visions of the future now are the future is a communist Chinese artificial intelligence governing us in tyranny, or it is environmental calamity, or it is environmentalism, where we all just ride bicycles to our jobs and lower our carbon footprint, including not having any children. We need to articulate what the future looks like for a future of larger families, of beautiful homes that people are proud to live in, and that they keep up as families and that build and bind their loyalties to their communities and ultimately to their nation. So we need help doing that. So that's one thing where I think, we need a real cultural politics. We can't dismiss that and say, oh, the only thing we can do is win elections and change policy. That's not true.
So the social landscape of America is very different now than it was in the heyday of National Review. And the one change that makes me most pessimistic about fusionism, which I am otherwise inclined to wholeheartedly support, is that it was easy for conservatives to stick up for capitalism when capitalists were themselves pretty conservative.
Yeah.
Whereas our wealthiest people now are completely liberal. And not just on social issues either. They're pretty much with the Democratic Party down the line. And that's dramatically different than it was even a few decades ago, where now you have the top 20 richest zip codes are all the bluest places in America.
Yeah.
So how does that change the
Even you
landscape?
saying that is making my skin itch. And I'm starting to call out to Sarah over there and say, like, let's just seize all their money. Maybe the new right is correct on that. Like, let's just take it from them. But in fact, woke capitalism is it is a kind of tumor on society. It grows out of some other fundamental unhealthiness in our society. Partly it is the fact that we decided we were going to solve the problem of upward mobility by just sending more and more people to college, graduating more people without the skills for a top-level liberal education. And we find out that when you do that, people used to joke, oh, what are these women's studies majors going to do in the real world? Well, it turns out they're going to run all your corporations and much of your social policy. All of these things are a jobs program. So on some level, we have to argue for making these people redundant in both senses of the word. That is, firing them en masse. I mean, most companies do not need these giant HR departments. I mean, we literally are creating a class of political commissars that exists at every level, and increasingly even at elementary schools. Not just private ones, it's slipping over to public ones. We are doing this with government mandates as well. Christopher Caldwell has made a very provocative argument that this all dates back to civil rights law. I think he's largely correct.
He is entirely correct.
But it is, also something that we've just allowed in our presence, that we have, and this is something people can stand up to as well. I mean, you can, as an employee of whatever corporation you're in, there's nothing stopping you from talking to executives about the uselessness of HR, the fact that they are a drag on producing real value, and in fact that their existence is about importing values that are foreign to your institution into it, right? I mean, IBM was once a company about making computers, but now IBM, like every other company, has this secondary mission that threatens to become the primary mission, which is IBM is a company about making IBM employees into progressives, and that's happening everywhere. So that's one where I'm a little bit with the new right. We have to take some of their toys away and take the resources away. They need to be redeployed toward more productive work. I mean, there's a lot of one thing we could do, following the presentation we had on architecture, is we could hire real men to tear down the ugly buildings, and the former HR employees can haul away the rubble by hand. That's a vision of the conservative future we could sell to the public.
Dougherty 2024.
Yeah.
All right, well, I think in the near future, we'll be able to throw it open to some questions from the audience, get a bit of Q&A in our last time. But I'll have a final question before I'll allow people time to compose some aggressive questions. But if you're thinking about new policy challenges to which the old fusionism doesn't supply an answer, China, which you mentioned, is one. The other huge one is big tech. And I think, I don't mind saying that I think the rote libertarian answer to that they're private companies and they can do what they want, is inadequate. But that doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't a fusionist answer to what to do about big tech. Do you think there's a fusionist answer of what to do about big tech?
That is a difficult one because big tech is in a difficult position. I mean, these companies, they are also products of their time. They are products of the 1990s in a way, and they have this kind of they were born with this 1990s ethos of, we can open up the whole world to itself, facilitate communication, and we will all become more liberal. I mean, almost all of these companies had American liberal, small L liberal ideals inside of them about free speech, and they frankly ignored the laws of every foreign nation they entered into, kind of championing these values. And that has no longer remained the case. And now Facebook, in particular, it responds to German legislators and American journalists criticizing them on Twitter. But they are locked in a competition with, that global competition now itself has changed because China has launched competitors to these that are in line with the Chinese state. Russia has launched some competitors too that are much more aligned with the kind of Russian civilization state. And so you see big tech caught in this position of they see their profits as being global monopolies, but they also are in some cases looking for security as the next generation's IBM, right? Like IBM was a kind of Cold War American company that never would have done Cold War a lot of business with the Soviet Union or the Soviet state. And I think if there is global competition with the Chinese Communist Party, you may see Google and Facebook and Apple looking to the United States government as a place of security in the future. I don't know if we have a policy solution for them. I mean, Facebook now faces a mortal threat already from Apple. Apple's shutting down the kind of spyware ability of Facebook to exist as a profit-making center, and Mark Zuckerberg is now flailing around.
It's great to watch, isn't it?
So it actually, yeah, it is. It is actually fun to watch. I don't think we have an answer for that, and I don't have an answer for that yet. The other problem, I do think that there's one problem I want to add, though, that you didn't mention, that the old fusionism, I think, has been inadequate for, and that the new fusionism needs to address itself to, which is housing costs and housing inflation. Because housing inflation is partly, it's not just, it would be easy for fusionists if it was just environmental regulation. But what we're talking about is, in many places, housing prices have reached their absurd heights because of local control of communities, which we don't want to abandon. So what we need to find is a system where middle-class people can save wealth and invest for the long-term health of themselves as individuals and as families in a vehicle other than their own low-interest rate mortgage and the inflation of the house that backs up. That's one where we need to find another vehicle for middle-class mobility than the 30-year mortgage, which is what's really the problem there. You can cut some regulation, but the left's answer is going to be to destroy local control. And I think we need to resist them there on that. So with that, I'm happy to throw it out to the rest.
Excellent. Well, John has the microphone, so we've got one right here.
Thanks. Thank you. I really enjoyed this. But I have to say, Michael, it seemed to me that you paint a picture.
Turn on.
Oh.
Well, if you're going to be that picky about it.
I was told it was on. Hello.
See, it's not my fault. Are we any
No.
How about if I just yell?
How about this? John, can you take the microphone back and see what's going on? And for your question, you can just project.
I've been told I project all the time anyway, so that's something I should be good at. I enjoyed your presentation. It seemed to me you give a very attractive view of fusionism at the level of principle. But I wonder how much this actually translates into the persons and into a practicable political union. And let me tell you why. I mean, it seems to me that when you talk at the level of principle, you end up leaving most libertarians, actual libertarian persons, out. And I wonder if there's not a reason for that. Speaking as someone, a friend of Russell Kirk, there's an ideology to libertarianism about a kind of godlike element of the individual, and it's being truly important in all things. And that, I think, clouds the judgment in dealing with the real problem here. I mean, I have no problem talking about the issue with big tech that we seem to always fail to talk about is the same issue that a lot of conservatives had with things like the railroads and the freeways. These were government boondoggles.
Right.
And so is big tech. Huge subsidies for decades with failing to tax them. And isn't it time to approach these concentrations of money and power in the same way that we approached things before? Preferably a better way than we did before. Isn't the point that we have to break up what is really ill-gotten socialized gains so that people can have more control over their own lives? And I don't think we're going to find support for that from ideological libertarians, even though we traditional conservatives can, I think, make a very coherent argument that we are actually on the side of liberty properly understood.
That's all very fair. You're right. I probably do leave out most of the for the very reason I said at the beginning, that professional libertarians turn liberty into the only political value against which everything is judged. That makes them unrealistic and anti-human in some ways. Whereas I was praising the kind of folk libertarian spirit in the American people, who just have an intuitive understanding of their liberties properly understood. That's true, but even the libertarian ideologues end up coming to our side when we're resisting the rule of the managerial expert class, almost all the time. I mean, with some exceptions, they usually do come around and marshal their arguments on our behalf. On big tech, it's interesting because you see the Biden administration using, international pressure to try to force places like Ireland to raise their tax rates on tech to get rid of some of this profiteering. I think we have to go a lot further than that and a lot deeper than that. And frankly, I think we could even have allies in France and Germany in seeking to end some of the profit hiding. One thing we could do, and that I think we don't talk about enough, maybe in the conservative movement, is we talk about fusionism as order and liberty, and which gets precedence or whatever. But of course, the genius of our founders was the idea that in a republican form of government, both of these could be master values that enrich each other. And I think we have in the tools in our Constitution to go at Silicon Valley's powers and to go at fundamentally the corruption of our body politic by financial firms and the Silicon Valley firms who literally buy our politicians and to whom our politicians seek to work after they have worked in government, right? I mean, not only, we've seen this in smaller forms throughout the government. We've seen FDA regulators who approve OxyContin and give it its the crazy label that allowed it to be prescribed to so many millions of people who shouldn't have been prescribed it. And then that regulator goes on to work for the lobbying firms, for the pharmaceutical companies, and make millions of dollars as a reward. And we see this all the time now. Nick Clegg from the Liberal Democrats is now the speech commissar for Facebook and decides whether Donald Trump can use social media. That power is very tempting, and the money that comes with it is very tempting. So we need a kind of anti-corruption movement within the right. I think that would appeal to the populist sentiment that is growing on the right, and that has to be aimed at erecting walls between people who are serving the public and serving us through our civic institutions and some of these private institutions that are serving themselves.
All right, more questions? Thank you, John.
Thank you. Oh, that's loud.
It's working now.
Yeah, it is. So, assuming we can achieve a new fusionism, let's just assume that. The old fusionism that was achieved had a talented spokesman in the form of Ronald Reagan that sort of transformed the country and the scene, if you will. Who do you see that could potentially be that kind of person that can meet the moment and the ideas and the new fusion if we can craft it?
I mean, and right now I don't see anyone of that caliber. I don't see anyone quite yet of Buckley's caliber either. William F. Buckley was not only a great columnist and writer for National Review, but a great television personality and a kind of with a mysterious accent that was part English boarding school, part Mexican housekeepers, and we don't have anyone like that right now. I mean, if you're asking me to pick out of a hat a Republican leader that I'm excited about. I mean, the only answer right now I think is Ron DeSantis as a national figure, because for 2 years he took the brunt of attacks on the issue that mattered most, which was our liberty versus Dr. Fauci's public health tyranny. And Donald Trump has spent most of those 2 years talking about his election loss and how he was cheated, which basically is a confession that he was unable to stop the cheating or unwilling to do it. And so, of course, if you believe him, why should you trust him again as president? Ron DeSantis gives at least some confidence. And the fact that people are moving to Florida, red people and blue people, is a sign that this is attractive to possibly a larger group than just the normal red Republicans. So right now, he's the one I would look to. I think he just has the instincts to do it. I don't know if he's the most mellifluous spokesman. I don't know if he's going to charm the right the way Reagan did. But again, these guys are just politicians too. A famous writer at National Review by about 1986 was saying, there's the phrase among conservatives, let Reagan be Reagan. By 1986, some people in the conservative movement were saying, let someone else be Reagan. Because, we'll get tired of DeSantis too someday. Put not your trust in princes is maybe the oldest and wisest bit of political advice we can have.
All right.
So pardon me, I
Sure.
don't really entirely get it. Is the new fusionism the old fusionism plus let's take on big tech? Is that what we're talking about?
I almost hope so. No, I think it is. There's a broader fear that big business is on the other side now, and what does that mean for us? And further, that the right is increasingly populated by, the right's voting bloc is increasingly populated by the working class people that the left have totally abandoned in their politics and in their imagination, as they have gone toward the upwardly mobile metropolitan college-educated voter. They have left the former union worker in the ditch. He's no longer even in a union, and his political energies are no longer, and his priorities are no longer expressed by the left. In fact, they're probably against him on most issues. So that is a political opportunity that the right has been sensing since the Nixon years, but has really come alive. Trump won. In the Reagan era, Republicans won college-educated voters. Now we lose them overwhelmingly. In the Reagan era, we lost, there was a great Wall Street Journal survey of Trump voters in the primaries. These are like, if you live in a mobile home, you were voting for Trump. The Democrats weren't even on your radar. So we have to incorporate the interests of those people into our politics somehow. And it can't just be moralizing lessons, right? We actually have to take their material interests at heart too. So I think it's not just the old fusionism plus big tech. It is the idea of a new conservative working class. And maybe that's an older politics itself. Maybe that goes back to Disraeli. Maybe there are models for us there to look to. But we need a patriotic working class, and it's open for us to win those people.
Chris.
Hi, thanks. I appreciate your presentation tonight, and this is for either one of you or both of you. I think the new right's criticism of fusion is politically it makes sense. As a coalition, you want addition and multiplication, not subtraction and division. Philosophically, it seems, just plain devil's advocate, that the new right feels that Meyer's version of a public liberty leads to a private virtue has not worked out, and that the new rights criticism is that we need a public virtue to lead to a private liberty. I just wonder if we can kind of narrow down a little bit, what is this new fusionism? What specifically is it? How is it different? And you both bring perspectives here on this, and I'd love to hear your description of what this new fusionism would look like. Thank you.
You should take a stab first.
Yeah. Well, answering the question, what makes the new fusionism new? Is it just the old fusionism plus taking on big tech? My answer to that question and to yours is that it's not just that fusionism faces new challenges today and has to come up with new answers. It's that fusionism got some really big things wrong in the last couple of decades. The right did not just observe the rise of China and its complete integration into our economic system. It facilitated it. It was complicit in the biggest economic, geostrategic, self-inflicted wound that any civilization has, inflicted on itself in hundreds of years. So new fusionism needs to have an answer for why that was bad and why we've learned lessons and we're not going to do it again. So that's why you need to update the sunny version of trade is always good, liberalization is always good, globalization is a win-win, we just need to compensate the losers or something. That's not going to cut it anymore. So facing up to some of the big mistakes. Also, in terms of mistakes, social conservatives have lost every fight in the last 30 years. I feel like they are where the electoral muscle of fusionism comes from. When you say talk about coalition politics, addition is always good. Well, social conservatives plus libertarians is like 100 people plus one guy. That's the proportion there. So, and it looks like social conservatives have not gotten a lot from that. They show up, they put politicians in office, and what do they get in exchange? Judges, who then give us the Bostock decision.
Right.
Thanks, Neil Gorsuch. Why did we screw up China? Why do social conservatives keep showing up and then losing?
Well,
we need to have answers to those two things.
And part of it is one reason why libertarian social issues win and conservative social issues lose is because libertarian social issues often have make a profit line available, right? So like you can make a profit selling weed legally in Colorado now.
Gambling. There's a lot of money in gambling.
There's a lot of money in gambling. Whereas conservatives are upholding non-commercial values, right? The value of family, the value of, particularly like when we're not living in an agrarian society where the eighth child makes it easier to plow the last field in your farm. We have to champion non-economic values. And I do believe that, as I said, the repristination of our Republican ideals gives us the tools to champion non-economic values and issues, social issues. We just have to grant ourselves, through making majorities, winning elections, and through ideas journals, the moral and political resources to act on it. And in fact, I think, there are a lot of people out there. We heard all these statistics today in that family session about the number of people born illegitimately or out of wedlock, out of the institutions, whether familial or communal, that formed us. I think many of them know they are missing something. They know, they long for the gifts that strong families and strong communities can give them. So we have to be bold enough to talk to them about it in a real way. I mean, I tried to do so in my own book to kind of bring a contrast to the ideals of atomization, or the ideals of self-definition that lead toward atomization, right? The modern world promises individuals, we'll let you define yourself entirely on your own. And it sounds like freedom. And in the 90s and when I was a young person, that sounded great. But of course, the end of that process is to leave you as a human being, as a subject that knows themselves subjectively, right? That it is to be totally cut off from relations with others. The project of self-actualization turns out to be profoundly lonely in the end, as progressives understand it. So we are the ones championing a political order which includes these other mediating institutions that make higher values like sacrifice noble and sensible to us. So, and that elevates us as human beings. And I think a lot of people would be open to it if we could meet the kind of poverty that they live in with some of these riches that we have as a civilization. They know that they're in a poor state. People don't actually like living through their phones, through just scrolling on Instagram or Twitter for a little hit of stimulation. They're looking for something deeper and more meaningful. So we have to offer it to them.
All right, we've got time for one more question. Oh, John's got one picked out. All right.
Hi, thank you for your time. I had a question about this concept you mentioned of social entropy.
Yeah.
And mainly what the relationship was of, this concept, thermodynamics concept to social sciences. And if you can, for like the new fusionism in the future, like can you put any faith in some kind of self-correction, or is this idea of social entropy, is it totally off the table, or yeah? I'm just curious about this concept of social entropy and its role for the new fusionism.
Sure. I bring up social entropy because that's just the language we conservatives naturally seem to fall into, is that we view society as having been better in the past, more approximating an ideal form, and then that becomes corrupted over time. And we talk about this as if this is the law of social orders. Like we began with a great constitution with the founders, and ever since then we've been falling away. And we rarely ever describe our politics in terms of restoration or resurrection. And that was no more apparent to me than, again, in my book, looking at my father's country, Ireland, and their nationalist heroes. They looked at the world as the Irish nation was destroyed by England, by Tudorism, by this monarchy, and we have to resurrect it from the dead, right? And they did not nearly accomplish all that they set out to. Ireland is neither Gaelic nor unified nor free in my book, but the politics that they championed and the social institutions they built did revive a language that was dying and made it a language of prestige. They did revive Irish sports and turn them into a massive cultural institution for forming young men and women in Ireland that actually has been remarkably free of the crassness and commercialization of sports we have here. So we need to talk about not just our institutions are falling apart, because it makes it sound like we're never going to get them together again. We need to talk about how we actually have it in our power to resurrect ideals and instantiate them in the world again. That's all I meant by that. We have to stop talking like total losers. And that was the one thing that Trump did intuit, I think, about the right and about conservatism, that there was a kind of passivity or acceptance, or that we somehow had internalized our enemy's idea that there's an arc of history, and the great rainbow flag terminates in the pot of gold of equality someday. You know, that's not what we believe, and we can't betray that we do really believe in it. Not if we want to win.
Excellent. Wonderful.
All right. Well, thank both of you. That was fantastic. And thank all of you for joining us this evening. I would encourage you to stay plugged into what we're doing at the American Conservative. As I mentioned before, we do want to be the forum in which we hash out this new fusionism that we've discussed here tonight. So please do join us, whether that's by becoming a member, receiving our print magazine, edited by Helen Andrews, every other month. It's excellent content. Or by becoming a member of one of our donor clubs. There's information in your programs as well. There's a lot of options there as well. So anyways, thank you all for joining us. Excellent discussion, and have a good night. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for that. That wasn't too bad.
That was fun.